started like any other eviction. A landlord, furious, slamming down papers and demanding a family leave. He thought he had it all under control. A black family, just trying to make ends meet, caught in his crosshairs. But what happened next? It shook the very foundation of what he thought was his domain. Because that family, they weren't tenants at all. They were the owners of the entire building. The landlord, Dan Hargrove, had always been a man of confidence. He prided himself on his control over his properties, enforcing rules with an iron fist. His newest target? The Johnson family. They lived on the 3rd floor of the building on Westgate Avenue, a modest but well-kept apartment complex. Hargrove had never liked them. To him, they were trouble, always asking for repairs, always challenging his authority. But this time, he had gone too far. When he stormed into the apartment that morning, he had no idea what he was walking into. "You're out," Hargrove snapped, pointing to the door. His voice was loud, filled with a venomous certainty. "You've got until the end of the week. No excuses." The Johnsons, Rita, Marcus, and their 2 kids looked stunned, but not for long. They'd heard the whispers of landlords getting hostile over the years, but they never thought it would be them. They didn't know it yet, but this moment would mark the beginning of a shocking series of events that would flip their world upside down. As Rita and Marcus sat in the dimly lit living room, trying to process what had just happened, a knock on the door interrupted their thoughts. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Lopez. She had news that sent chills down their spines. "Did you know?" Mrs. Lopez asked hesitantly, her eyes darting around nervously. "The landlord doesn't actually own this building." Rita's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked. Mrs. Lopez leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "The building was sold years ago, but no one ever told the tenants. It's actually in the name of a trust. You've been paying rent to someone who doesn't even own it. The real owners, well, that's you." The words hit them like a freight train. They couldn't believe it. The entire building, every apartment, every hallway, every inch belonged to them? But how could they have missed something like that? The paperwork, the leases, they all seemed so legitimate. As the Johnsons scrambled to figure out what had happened, a call came in. It was their lawyer, Chris Marlowe, a scrappy young attorney who'd taken on cases too big for most. His voice was grim. "I'm looking at your lease right now. It's not what it seems. There's something off about the ownership records. Hargrove never had a chance to evict you, because, legally, he doesn't have the right to." The shock didn't stop there. Chris dug deeper and found out that the building's deed had been signed over to the Johnsons years ago, when Rita's late father, a successful real estate investor, had passed away. The trust was hidden in a series of convoluted papers that had slipped under the radar. The landlord had never bothered to verify the information. He was too busy counting the rent checks. But there was one thing the Johnsons hadn't expected: the trail of manipulated evidence. It all started when Chris went to the county clerk's office to inspect the building's ownership records. What he found was a web of deceit. The deed had been altered. The documents were missing key signatures, and someone had tampered with dates to make it appear as if Hargrove had purchased the building years ago. The county had no record of any legitimate transfer. But the most shocking part? The person who had tampered with the documents was no stranger: Hargrove's own assistant, Amber Collins. She'd been the one to notarize the forged papers. She was the one who had made sure Hargrove had control, despite the fact that he had no legal claim. Just when they thought they were out of options, an unexpected ally arrived. It was Mrs. Lopez again, but this time, she was carrying more than just gossip. She had a series of photos and documents hidden in a thick envelope. "You didn't hear this from me," she said nervously. "But Amber Collins? She didn't do this on her own. She was paid off by someone much higher up. A big player. Someone you don't expect." Rita and Marcus looked at each other, confused and wary. "Who?" Rita asked. "Your landlord's connection with the real estate mogul Carl Lawrence. He's the one behind everything. He's the one who wants to drive you out of here." Carl Lawrence, an influential figure with a track record of pushing out tenants to build luxury apartments, had been quietly pulling the strings all along. Amber Collins wasn't the mastermind, she was just the pawn. And now, the Johnsons were caught in the crossfire. As the case began to unfold in court, another twist emerged. A key witness, one of Hargrove's former tenants, came forward to testify. She claimed that Hargrove had been kind, compassionate, and always on the side of the residents. She had nothing but praise for him. But there was something strange about her testimony. Her story didn't add up. In fact, it sounded rehearsed, too perfect. Chris, the lawyer, had seen this before. He didn't trust her. That's when the bombshell dropped. Chris had been able to trace the woman's financial history. She'd recently received a large sum of money directly from Carl Lawrence's company. The courtroom was tense as Chris stood up and delivered the final blow. He presented evidence of the bribery. The woman was a hired actor, a fabricated witness paid to skew the case in Hargrove's favor. But just as the judge was about to call for a ruling, a new figure appeared at the door. It was Amber Collins, the same woman who had notarized the forged documents. She was shaking, her face pale, her hands trembling. "I can't do this anymore," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was forced to lie. I didn't want any part of this. Hargrove, Carl Lawrence, they made me do it." The courtroom fell silent. Amber's words hung in the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Had she just exposed everything? But then, something unexpected happened. The lights flickered, and the courtroom door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The judge looked up, confused, as the door swung open again, revealing a tall, shadowy figure in the doorway. No one could make out his face, but one thing was clear: he wasn't there by accident. And just as quickly as the figure had appeared, the lights went out. The last thing anyone heard before everything went black was a voice, low, steady, and full of menace. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning." The room was plunged into darkness, leaving everyone on the edge of their seats. What would happen next? Would the truth finally come to light, or would the shadows of power and corruption swallow it whole? The case was far from over, and the Johnsons were just getting started. The lights flickered again. For a long moment, the courtroom was plunged into utter darkness. A hum of nervous whispers filled the air, followed by a few faint gasps as the tension in the room escalated. The only sound was the hurried shuffle of feet as people tried to adjust to the sudden blackout. No one knew what to do, no one, except for one figure in the center of the room. Rita Johnson's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the unknown bearing down on her. Just seconds ago, Amber Collins had broken the silence, her confession sending shockwaves through the courtroom. But now, as the lights remained out, an eerie stillness descended, and the mystery deepened. A voice, deep, ominous, and calm, broke through the silence. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning." Rita's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if the voice was a threat or a warning, but it filled the room with an undeniable sense of dread. She looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the shadows swallowed every corner of the courtroom. Then, as suddenly as the blackout had come, the lights blinked back on. The room was still eerily still. The figure in the doorway was gone. The air felt thick, as if the very walls themselves were closing in on them. Everyone in the room looked around, but nothing was amiss except for the lingering uncertainty that no one could shake off. Amber Collins was still standing there, her face ashen, her hands trembling. She hadn't been part of this larger conspiracy willingly, but her fear was real. Rita could see the woman who had once been the villain now standing as a victim, terrified of what she had unleashed. Who was that? Chris Marlowe, the Johnson family's lawyer, asked, his voice laced with suspicion. His eyes scanned the room, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone, ready to alert the authorities. And why did the lights go out? But Amber didn't answer. Instead, she simply collapsed into a chair, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anymore." Rita stood frozen, staring at Amber, struggling to process everything. The twists kept coming, one after another. Was this orchestrated to intimidate them? Was this the beginning of something bigger? Was Carl Lawrence the real estate mogul behind this shadowy figure? Days passed since the chilling courtroom encounter, but the shock still hung in the air like a dark cloud. Despite Amber's confession, the case remained far from resolved. The authorities had begun investigating, but the higher-ups seemed strangely uninterested. Every time Chris and Rita followed a lead, it was met with delays, roadblocks, or unexplained interference. It became evident that the Johnsons weren't just battling Hargrove and Lawrence, they were fighting a system designed to protect the wealthy, to shield those in power from accountability. And as they dug deeper, they found that this wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a pattern, a systemic issue deeply rooted in the city's real estate market. Rita's resilience grew with every passing day. She wasn't just fighting for her family anymore. She was fighting for every tenant who'd been pushed out of their home by people like Hargrove and Lawrence. For every person who had been silenced, taken advantage of, or ignored. The stakes were higher than ever. One late evening, as Rita and Chris sifted through yet another pile of documents, Rita stumbled upon something, a paper buried deep within an old file. It was a meeting memo from years ago between Hargrove and Lawrence. It outlined plans to slowly buy up properties in the neighborhood, evicting the tenants under false pretenses, all to flip the buildings for luxury condos. The memo was dated just weeks before her father had passed away. It was clear that Lawrence had been planning this for years and Hargrove had been his puppet. Her hands shook as she read the final lines. Johnson family must be removed before the next phase begins. Leverage their financial instability. That was the key. They hadn't just evicted them to take over the building, they targeted the Johnsons specifically, exploiting the family's moment of vulnerability. Rita felt a rage surge through her. This was about much more than just a building. This was about race, about power, about a system designed to make people like her family invisible. Rita knew that if they were going to stand a chance at winning, they needed to expose the broader scheme. They needed to shine a light on the corruption that had gone unchecked for far too long. She and Chris spent hours meeting with reporters, digging through public records, and even visiting other tenants who had been affected by similar tactics. The deeper they dug, the more they found. Every lead they followed seemed to connect back to Lawrence or his underlings. It was becoming clear that what they were up against wasn't just an unethical landlord, it was a coordinated network of corrupt individuals, using their power and wealth to exploit vulnerable communities. The press picked up on the story quickly. News outlets were calling it the case of the evicted family who owns the building. But as the media coverage grew, so did the pressure. Hargrove and Lawrence pushed back with every tool at their disposal. Legal maneuvers, media spin, and even public attacks on the Johnsons' character, anything to discredit them and protect their interests. But Rita wasn't backing down. She could feel the weight of the moment. She had become more than just a figurehead in this battle. She was a symbol of resistance against a system that had too long ignored the cries of marginalized communities. The case finally went to trial, but it wasn't the straightforward legal battle the Johnsons had hoped for. Every day in court felt like an uphill struggle. The prosecution, heavily backed by Lawrence's wealth, tried everything they could to weaken their case. Witnesses who were paid off to lie, evidence that mysteriously went missing, and hostile cross-examinations meant to wear them down. But Rita didn't falter. She took every setback in stride, sharpening her resolve. She knew that this trial wasn't just about them, it was about setting a precedent, about showing the world that justice could be achieved, no matter how stacked the odds. In the final days of the trial, Chris presented the irrefutable evidence, the meeting memo, the financial records, the testimonies from other tenants. He laid bare the systematic corruption and the coordinated efforts to exploit the Johnsons. The truth was undeniable. And then came the breakthrough, the smoking gun. Amber Collins, who had initially been too afraid to speak out, finally stepped up and testified, not as a pawn, but as a whistleblower. Her testimony was devastating. She confirmed everything. The forged documents, the bribery, the manipulation, and the conspiracy to drive the Johnsons out of their home. She named names, pointing to Carl Lawrence as the mastermind behind it all. It was the turning point they needed. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned, the verdict was clear. Hargrove and Lawrence were guilty not just of fraud, but of a coordinated effort to exploit and displace an entire community. The judge handed down the sentence. Not only were they ordered to pay damages to the Johnsons, but the entire building was to be returned to them, free of any further claims from the real estate mogul. The ruling was a victory not just for the Johnsons, but for everyone who had been subjected to the abuse of power and systemic prejudice. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. The victory was symbolic, showing that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Rita stood in the courtroom after the trial, looking out at the sea of reporters. Her heart swelled with pride. This was just the beginning. There were still many battles to fight, but she was ready. She wasn't going to stop until justice was truly served for her family, for every tenant, and for anyone who had ever been silenced. She turned to Chris and smiled. "We did it." Chris nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "We did." As the cameras flashed, Rita looked around at the faces of her community, of those who had supported her, of those who had stood with her even when the world seemed against her. It wasn't just about the building. It was about something much bigger. It was about hope, about fighting back against a system that tried to crush them. And now they had won. If this story moved you, if you believe in justice, fairness, and the power of community, then you're not alone. The fight against prejudice and systemic injustice is ongoing, and your voice matters. Subscribe to stay up to date on more stories like this one, and together, we can continue to push for change, one story at a time.